Good evening, everyone. I'm Liz Joyner, founder and president of the Village Square. On behalf of the Village Square and Florida Humanities, we're delighted you've joined us tonight for Majority Minority with Dr. Justin Gest. This program is part of a multi-year series of digital programs, Unum Democracy Reignited, presented in partnership with Florida Humanities. The programs will explore the past, present, and future of the American idea as it exists on paper, in the hearts of our people, and as it manifests in our lives. If you are familiar with the work of Florida Humanities, we're putting their web address in the chat window. Be sure to check them out. I also want to mention that the chat window will be closed tonight, but you may ask questions at any time during the program by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. And if you haven't taken our anonymous pre-event survey yet that we sent you by email, if you just take a moment to do so now, we're dropping the link in the chat thread. Your honest answers will help the Village Square with a major nationally scoped research effort to better understand divisions in the United States. Even if you've done the survey at another event, we're asking you if you can take a moment to do it again tonight. Tonight, we're delighted to welcome streaming partners Listen First Project, BridgeUSA, USC Center for the Political Future, Common Ground Committee, Civic Health Project, Unify, Citizen Connect, Center for the Humanities at the University of Miami, and our wonderful long-term partners, the Tallahassee Democrat and WFSU Public Media. If you want to do your part to support the cause of a healthy democracy, when you get off tonight's Zoom, we recommend that you subscribe to and support a journalistic effort near you. If local journalism dies, democracy won't be far behind. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Manu Meel. Manu is a social entrepreneur who is passionate about empowering young people. And he's got a cool story. Protests on the campus of UCal Berkeley over a planned visit by right-wing provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos inspired then freshman Manu Meel to establish what has now become BridgeUSA, an organization that aims to promote democracy, not partisanship, and now has 43 campus chapters in 19 states. Manu was recently named to Forbes 30 Under 30 in education. Manu, welcome.
Thank you, Liz, for having me. Very excited for the conversation, but we got to get to the real guests.
So I'm pretty sure that I met you your sophomore year. And I want to say, you know, people were talking about just what good work you guys are doing. And I think my greatest hope is that we could work together until you were a senior. And really what you've done with BridgeUSA has surpassed. Really, I just think it's really been incredible.
And I just have to say, I know we got a program, but I have to say that Liz has been an amazing mentor. And as young people that have built that is focused on reducing polarization and building a movement around helping people to have conversations, something that I thought was very obvious, Liz. You've been an amazing help. So I'm
Thank you. Our people who are joining us tonight should know that there's an amazing network of organizations out there that are working really hard to reverse the challenging situation we're in. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Justin Gest, an associate professor of policy and government at George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government. He is the author of 6 books, including his most recent, Majority Minority. He writes primarily on the politics of immigration and demographic change. Justin has also appeared on, this is a long list, I'm going to do it fast, ABC, BBC, CNN, NPR, and contributed to The Atlantic, The Boston Globe, The Guardian, Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Politico, Reuters, The Times, Vox, and The Washington Post. He does not sleep, apparently. From 2010 to 2014, Justin was a postdoctoral fellow and lecturer at Harvard University's Departments of Government and Sociology. He's been awarded the highest award for faculty teaching at both Harvard and George Mason University. He earned his bachelor's degree at Harvard University and his PhD at London School of Economics, where he ultimately co-founded and served as the co-director of the Migration Studies Unit. Welcome, Justin.
It is my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great. It's great to be with Manu.
It's really great to have you here tonight. And before I leave, I want to say that this is my second deep dive into Dr. Gest's part of scholarship. And we hosted him on his 2016 book, The New Minority: White Working Class Politics in the Age of Immigration and Inequality. when we ought to have been listening very closely to him. I consider him one of the most wise and prophetic voice on understanding demographic change and how we can respond to it. Gentlemen, take it away.
Thank you so much, Liz. And as Liz said, this is not only a needed conversation, but it's necessary. I want to get two things out of the way, and then I'm going to ask some questions. The first is that I took Dr. Gest's permission to be able to call him Justin. So anyone that is concerned about the way that I refer to Justin from now on, know that I have special permission. And second, as someone that has written 0 books, I have to say that the book that I read from Justin has just been fascinating. Majority Minority. It is an amazing read, and importantly, and this is where I want to get into it, the key question and the key reason that the book starts off with is that in 2044, the US Census has reported that the United States will officially be a majority minority country. And you're probably wondering what that means, and we're going to get right into it. And before that, I want to give a quick overview of the program. So for the first about 20 minutes, we're going to just lay out the book. What is the argument? What is the thesis? What are the problems that we're contending with? The second section is I'm going to ask some what I call Thornier questions, questions that get at the theory, the argument, to dig deeper into it. The section after that is for you, the audience. Would love to hear questions. Let us know what you're thinking. Anything that you felt was provocative, anything that got you thinking, because ultimately, as I've learned from this book, the only way that we get over this obstacle / problem / opportunity, however you think about it, is by actually talking. So I'll turn it right over to you, Justin. Why write the book?
Thanks, Manu. You know, there's so many reasons to write this book in my life. You know, personally, before we kind of get into the scholarly reasons behind it, you know, I grew up in a majority minority environment. And of course, by majority minority, what I mean is where one or more ethnic or religious minority groups come to outnumber the ethnic or racial majority of a space. And that was Los Angeles, California for me. I went to majority minority schools during my childhood, and I grew up in one of the world's most diverse cities. And in many ways, that presaged the demographic change that was going to come over the United States, you know, later in my life. But it was something that I was always acutely attentive to, even as a youngster. I'm the son of a refugee, you know, who is part of a wave of immigration during the 20th century that fundamentally changed the complexion of this country. And so immigration and demographic change is part of who I am. And of course, as Americans, I think it's part of who all of us are. But in my family, that journey, that experience was more recent. You know, for scholarly reasons, you know, as Liz kind of intimated, my work has always been in this space about immigration. But what interests me not only is the governance of immigration, the way a society manages who we let in, how we select them, and who gets to be a member. Those questions have always fascinated me. But what also has always fascinated me is the reception of those immigrants, the consequences of immigration. And as we've seen, you know, over the course of the last decade or so, the backlash to immigration has been really brutal. It's been incredibly grave. And it's really been defining our politics. I think a very good argument could be made that immigration and demographic change, the shadow of this demographic change, is in many ways the fulcrum of our political partisanship, is the fulcrum of our partisan differences, the issue that so many things rotate around. Yeah. And so, you know, the prospect of a majority minority demographic future to me was a sort of shadow that was cast over our politics. And it infused my earlier works on immigration policy, on white working class politics, on Muslim politics. The specter of that demographic change was always there. And in this book, I wanted to hit it right on the head.
Let me ask you this, and I'm going to actually split up both of the question sections into 2 parts. So this one specifically, you said, this is about who I am. And that is, to me, what makes this issue so difficult to resolve, is because it's about who we are. And you mentioned in the book that a key piece of this work is expanding the definition of we. Can you explain what people think of when they think of we right now as the United States? And I know that it varies by whoever you're asking, but I'm curious.
There's no way I could possibly explain who we think of as we. This is precisely, I think, the national conversation that demographic change stimulates. because when immigrants arrive, the first question that comes to everyone's mind is, who are they? Right? Who's that over there? Where they come from? What do they like? What do they believe? What do they want? What are they here for? Right? It's a natural question, right? Who are you? The second question, I think, though, is where we are today, which is once we've responded to the question of who are they, usually there's a desire to make them more like us, or to at least make them fit in with us. It's like, okay, well, if they are going to be here with us, then they need to be a little bit more like us. Okay, well, then that stimulates this number two question, which is, who are we? And that's where we are. And the third question, by the way, that we want to eventually get to is, who can we be together? And I think that those simple questions, who are they, who are we, and who can we be together, are fundamental to this entire issue. And, some people believe that immigration and assimilation is a one-way street, that newcomers arrive and that they should adapt in every way possible to assimilate into whatever the mainstream is, we decide the mainstream to be. That's a simplification, I think. And it also presumes that there is only one mainstream. And it presumes that that mainstream is somehow static, that it doesn't evolve, that it doesn't change with the composition of our population. There's another view that sees it as a two-way street, right? That who we are and who they are both relevant to who we will become. And that integration is a two-way street, and that newcomers will adapt, but those of us who are here will also adapt to their presence. And maybe we'll even learn from their presence and gain from their presence and be better for their presence because of what we learn from them and the relationships that we build together. And that'll be a source of strength. But certainly that fundamental question of who we are is central and provoked by demographic change, but is also central to the identity politics that is shredding our social fabric right now.
Dean, Richard, Frank, all the others that have questions, please continue submitting them. We're going to answer them in the Q&A. Appreciate your engagement. You said, who are they? Who are we? Who can we be together? What about this issue and what about this notion of immigration makes it so difficult to talk about? Why is it that the concept of a majority-minority status is something that is so significant?
Again, it's going to be a to each their own kind of situation, but everyone's going to come at it with some degree of gravity. And the reason why, of course, is that it's somewhat existential of a question. As a democracy, we are who we are comprised by. We are constituted by the people, by the population, that lives here. And so when that population changes, it is only natural for us to anticipate that our society and our country will change with it. We don't have, this sort of second-class citizenship, at least not formally, to separate, people apart. Generally speaking, over the course of U.S. history, we have evolved over time and changed with the composition of our population. And so there's no reason to think that that will stop now. That is what raises the stakes when it comes to demographic change, because inevitably, there are going to be some people in our society who are invigorated by that demographic change, and they hotly anticipate it and are thrilled by it, and are excited to experience what it will mean for the country's evolution and betterment. But then there are also others who are fundamentally discomforted by that demographic change, by the uncertainty that it stimulates, by the questioning and the insecurities that we have as a society. And as a result, it creates a lot of nostalgia, people who want to hit the brakes, not anticipating the future, but in many ways resisting its progress in ways that are probably not even sustainable. So, I think that most people come at this issue with a great degree of gravity because of its existential nature.
I want to put a pin in that question of existential because it gets at a very recent current event, the Buffalo shooting. But I want to hold that for a second and zoom out and allow you space to make the broader argument, which is, I think, what you just got at there, which is that there's a balance between some that feel invigorated and excited, see this as an opportunity, and others that feel this to be a risk to their power. How do you reconcile those? And how do you ensure that those two groups of people, whoever they may be, find some sort of common cause in answering the question, who can we be together?
Yeah, this is a fundamental question. And, what this book does to help us find an answer, to arrive at some conclusions, is it looks at other societies that have gone through this question before. It looks at other places who can help us understand how societies respond to demographic change. And so, most people think that the United States is kind of, on an island, if you will, right now. We're on our own, and this is sort of breaking new ground. And in many ways, I think we are. We're an enormous society and a big democracy that is about to go through this fundamental demographic change. But while we are, it is a rare milestone to have a majority-minority shift. It's not unique to the United States. It has happened before. It's just happened to very small microcosmic societies, many of which are islands, and the countries that I study, the societies that I study, all happen to be islands. It's not where I pick them, but it just so happens that they're islands. It's not that surprising. Islands are exposed to as crossroads of the world because they are approachable from all different angles in the sea. They are historically a sort of a nexus, I think, during empire and colonialism, and certainly today with global commerce. And islands are also interesting because they're kind of like laboratories, these small microcosms. So we can study them as a laboratory, as an example of what happens when human societies are confronted with great demographic shifts. So the countries that I study are Mauritius, Trinidad and Tobago, Singapore and Bahrain, and Hawaii and New York. And New York, of course, is not its own country, although many New Yorkers wish they were their own country.
Or they're not Texas yet. They're not Texas.
Texas is probably in the same category along with California, my home state. But, I think that, New York simulates the same kind of sovereign country feeling historically, because New York once had sovereign control over who was admitted from an immigration perspective and who was deported. And the same, by the way, is true for Hawaii, which, while it's not its own country today, was its own sovereign kingdom up until 1893, when the United States government forcibly annexed it. And so all of these societies do simulate sovereign control over immigration and had to respond to enormous demographic change. And I know we'll get into the details of these different places soon. But to get to your question, I think most people, when they are talking about the prospects for demographic change and how we respond to it, I think most people are very concerned today with the eradication of racism and prejudice and xenophobia and nativism. And they say that only when we can eradicate these scourges from American society, from any society that's diversifying, can we actually expect to make progress socially. But in my book, I actually argue something different. Across the different societies that I study, even the most successful adaptations that were made, there was still prejudice, there was still racism, there is still nativism and distrust and xenophobia to some degree. In many ways, what I find is that, in fact, that distrust, that xenophobia, that prejudice, that is the turf upon which social progress must be made. It is the challenge that we must endure in the process of coping with demographic change. And in fact, we're not subject to these uncontrollable, human prejudices all the time. What I find actually, and ultimately, is that immigration and demographic change is ultimately subject to good governance. It is a milestone that must be managed. We must be conscious of how we are actually governing the shift and preparing a people for demographic change, particularly when we see it on the horizon. And that's something that our country has simply not done much of, which is what gives me hope for the future, because I think there are things we can do to pivot towards greater inclusion and away from the politics of exclusion.
There's so much there in that answer, and I've got so many different routes that I can take this conversation. And so I'm going to do my best. I've got three sort of avenues I want to take this. But first, I'm going to ask what might seem like a stupid question. 23, you got to give me a break. So the stupid question I've got is, why talk about this? Like, it's not like in 2044, suddenly everyone's going to feel that, there's a majority minority country. We still see diversity. I see that, there's people that look different than me around me. What is your response to those that say that even talking about this argument actually makes it a problem? That we can just naturally transition into this? because we're kind of already there in many communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love that. I wish we wouldn't talk about it so much, actually. But I'm not the one that's starting this conversation. In many ways, this milestone, and as I mentioned earlier, the sort of shadow of this milestone, which I think is much greater, much larger, the shadow that's cast by it is much larger than the actual milestone itself in terms of its significance for our country. I think it's really overblown. But nevertheless, it's there. And to try to pretend otherwise by just saying, oh, let's just not talk about it, it's to not acknowledge an enormous, pink elephant in the proverbial room. It is something that is defining, that is contorting, and manipulating our politics today in a way I think that we can better understand. And so if we don't seek to understand it, and if we only ignore it, then we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes that other societies have made.
There appears to be a tension that I'm trying to resolve. And that tension is that this is both, and this is sort of that first of three paths. So the tension seems to be that this isn't actually something that we should be talking about in a way that is that significant, but because honestly, it's happening in many places. But at the same time, it is significant in that most societies don't experience this. So how do you walk that balance? And I think the reason why that is a relevant thing to think about is because, again, walking that balance, there are those that are trying to posture this moment as a huge opportunity, and there are others that are posturing this as an existential risk. So would you say that this is a significant thing that is so unique that we should rally around and try to solve? Or should we treat this not as a significant problem, but just create spaces to talk about? How do you navigate that balance?
Oh, I'm not sure that those two things are mutually exclusive. I think that even if we acknowledge it as a big problem, we still have to talk about it. And I think it is incontrovertibly a problem. This is, as I asserted earlier, I think that this is the fulcrum around which our politics and partisanship is revolving right now. You have one party in this country that is, cosmopolitan and globalistic and ushering into a future, and rushing into that future as quickly as possible, eager to evolve into some kind of demographic destiny. And then you have another party that is nationalist and nostalgic and consumed with the past and looking to assert control. And so I think to ignore this and just simply say, well, something that we kind of work out through a sort of therapy is not enough. I think it has to be governed. I think that the government, I think our government, I think our business leaders, I think our civil society leaders all need to pitch in. We need millions of people who are prepared to actually start having these conversations that are stimulated by demographic change, to talk about this question of who are we and who we want to be together.
I just want to say this is such a fascinating and important discussion. The way that you're navigating this conversation is, I think, exactly how we should be navigating it, which is thinking about the questions and talking about them in a constructive way. Let me take you down path two, and this gets to current event. You mentioned the existential risk that this poses. Let's be honest, and you articulate this in the book, that that's primarily the majority white population in the United States, that is the group writ large, obviously without trying to generalize too much, that would have the most to quote unquote lose when you are actually trying to get at the core question. There was a shooting in Buffalo, as we all know, where the shooter, an 18-year-old man, had a manifesto that talked about the Great Replacement Theory. Can you apply that notion of existential risk to that act? How should we be discussing that question, and how should we be tackling it?
Absolutely. The grand replacement theory or replacement theory is connected directly, wired to the majority minority milestone. It asserts a conspiracy that there are elites, largely led by Jews, they argue, who are interested in replacing white Christian and the white Christian population of countries, not just the United States, but also in Europe, they allege, with non-white peoples, apparently in some kind of effort towards world domination. And I'm not really sure how those two things are connected, but I'm sure a replacement theorist could explain it. In any case, the majority minority milestone is, I think, in many ways, the sort of culmination of that nightmare scenario for white supremacists and white nationalists. It is that sort of point of no return that they fear so much. And so inevitably, demographic change is hardwired into their conspiracy theory, and it is leading people to react in violent ways. And that is a product of us not having a real conversation about what our future looks like. It is the product of us not having a real conversation about how this is actually just a part of a greater evolution of this country, and that in fact we've been here before, that this is not actually our first majority minority milestone. And this is something that I'm sure you and I will get into later, so it's a good tease. But how being a country whose demographics evolve over time is something that is inevitably part of our future, but also part of our past. It is who we are today. And so to understand how we've navigated the past and how we want to navigate the future, that is something that we cannot ignore. And otherwise we leave the public sphere to be dominated by fear mongers, by exclusivists and by conspiracy theorists. We leave the sort of media public sphere to be run by algorithms, which is what has produced where we are today. We have largely not applied any kind of handlebars to this debate because we're not talking about it honestly and in an informed manner. And so the really tragic events of Buffalo are a manifestation of this and the sense of lost control that many white people feel about this majority minority milestone that they believe is so existential.
So I want to now start getting to the solutions aspect of this. You mentioned 6 case studies. The way that I'm going to split up this part of the conversation is first talk about the individual. I think you make a lot of cases and arguments for expanding the definition of we, how we as people need to address this. But then the second thing that you've hinted at, which is it's governable. And so I want to get at some policy solutions and some tangible things that policymakers can do. Does that sound good as a flow?
You're in control. You're in the driver's seat here.
Cool. So in terms of the individual, you outlined 6 case studies. Which of these 6, and I think you split it up 2-2-2. So which one of those would you articulate is the most instructive example for how the United States should approach this question, but specifically how we as individuals should approach this question? Because I want to keep the governable part separate. So how should we as people approach this question based on the case studies that you found?
Sure. So there are three different types of cases, as you mentioned. I actually don't think that there's one or another that is more instructive. There's certainly more hopeful endings to some of these, or at least endings to the story so far in some places or others. But they all hold lessons, for the United States and for Western democracies that are diversifying today. The first set, Singapore and Bahrain, these are autocratic countries. They're non-democratic spaces where the government asserts enormous amounts of control over demographic change in order to resist it and to control the ethnic or religious makeup of their population. The second set of countries, and so I call those countries suppressive in nature. They're characterized by suppression. The other set of countries, the second set of countries, are Trinidad and Tobago and Mauritius. These are island nations in the East Caribbean and the Western Indian Ocean, respectively, that are democracies, but they are highly racialized democracies, where the political parties are deeply connected to different racial groups. In the case of these 2 countries, it's people of Indian origin and people of African origin. And they're characterized by terrible ethnic tension between the groups politically and total paralysis politically. Then the final set of cases are New York and Hawaii, both of which are obviously now part of the United States. But as I mentioned earlier, Hawaii was once sovereign and independent. And these are 2 more hopeful cases because over the course of their history, the question of who are we was subject to reconstitution, a sort of redefinition of who we are after really great ethnic or demographic change. Obviously, these were democratic spaces, although Hawaii was actually a monarchy, a kingdom, that changed the conception of who they are in order to accommodate and adapt to their demographic inevitabilities, their demographic futures. And we can learn something from each of these, Manu, there are countervailing trends. So just for instance, Singapore, I mentioned, is autocratic, and they utilize racial tension and racial differences in almost every expression of governance there, in the provision of social services and education of children, in immigration selection. Everything is done according to what they call race. And race there is defined by whether you are Chinese, the vast majority of Singaporean population, Indian, most of whom are Tamil origins, and Malay, who are from effectively the indigenous population in the Southeast Asian context. And that is not a great way of managing things. It's very suppressive. On the other hand, Singapore is, I think, a paragon of actual sophisticated thought put into how to create one nation, how to answer the question of who we are and who we will be together. And so even while the government does all kinds of terrible tactics, in my mind, to reinforce a lot of ethnic and racial divisions inside their society, they're also actively thinking about how to promote harmony and a sense of common identity and common purpose in their country. And so these countervailing trends means that we can take something good and something bad away from almost any context.
I'm curious, because I think a big part of the book, and especially in those 6 case studies, you talk a lot about the role that leaders play in the in-groups and the out-groups. Can you pull apart the level of responsibility that leaders have in this question of navigating race and the majority-minority milestone versus the responsibility that we as people have? Because it appears to me that leaders play a big role, but ultimately it's up to the people and how they interact. How do you sort of pull those two apart?
Sure. So at its core, when we're talking about differences between a majority and a minority group, when we're talking about race, when we're talking about ethnicity, these boundaries are completely socially constructed. And what that means they are what we make of them. There is nothing biological behind them. We are asserting the lines that divide people. And leaders play an enormous role in the construction of those boundaries and the significance that we attribute to them, because they tell us how to understand them in a way that is much more powerful because of the size of their proverbial megaphone, right? So as a result, leaders hold outsized weight and power to help us not only understand where boundaries lie, but also what boundaries mean. And so across these different societies, we see the role that leaders can play, and we also see the temptations that many leaders fall into and succumb to when they are incentivized to use those boundaries in order to divide so that they can win in elections. And so the role of leaders cannot be understated, but it's important that I also emphasize that leaders are not just in government. They do emerge in the business space, they emerge in the civil society space, and all of us, even down to the leaders of nuclear families, have a role to play in discussing and asserting the importance or the lack of significance of these boundaries that are dividing us today.
Do you think that the backlash to demographic change when it comes to local leaders, national leaders, community and civic leaders, do you think that backlash is a uniquely Western and white phenomenon, or do you think that backlash is a human condition? It's a result.
It's very much a human condition. So heretofore, I'm by far not the first researcher who was interested in studying the effect of demographic change.
However, did a great job.
Thanks so much. Well, I stand on the shoulders of giants, and there are a number of giants who have studied this. However, most of those giants are psychologists or political psychologists. And when you're a psychologist, your unit of analysis is the individual. And so you are usually testing the effect of some kind of treatment, the exposure to some information or some environment on people's viewpoints and behavior. And so what mostly psychologists have done up until now is that they have exposed people to information about great demographic change, or they have simulated the demographic change that's going to take place. But psychology experiments take place in a few minutes, in a very short setting. One of the longest treatments actually involved 10 days. So demographic change takes a lot longer than 10 days to take place. It takes decades. Sometimes it takes a full century to really hold its effect. And so while these giants in psychology, their work is very important, because what it showed was that people's instinctive differences, instinctive reactions to demographic change and being notified of great demographic change is to respond defensively, often territorially, often with exclusion and fear and uncertainty. That is the sort of natural human instinct when exposed to rapid demographic change. But we just don't know what happens at the societal level when you have decades of demographic change that takes place far slower than these psychology experiments can possibly simulate. Demographic change is a block by block phenomenon. It's a year by year, decade by decade phenomenon that's slow, and it takes time to take effect. And sometimes you don't notice when it's happening because it moves so slowly, much like you don't notice the barometric pressure around you or the rotation of the earth on its axis. And so if we're really going to understand how people respond to demographic change at a societal level, we have to look at a societal level. And so, for that reason, while I engage in some kind of political psychological techniques towards the end of the book to really understand political behavior a little bit better in the face of demographic change, I also want to look at these countries' experiences and have the benefit of looking at the long durée of history to better understand what happens.
Yeah, and I'm gonna slowly take my cue and get to the governable questions. The societal level. What are some tangible things that policymakers can look at? The last question I have on the individual side is, you mentioned it's a block by block phenomenon, and what we found at Bridge, and we work with young people across universities and campuses, is that people want to be a part of a community. People want ultimately to be part of an identity. And you mentioned the American identity and as being unique in that it's primarily thin nationalism, right? The American identity is not as cohesive and as strong as, say, being German, right? How can you build, maybe you want to problematize that notion, and I'm curious about it, but how can you build community in this majority minority world that potentially transcends race and ethnicity, or is it not possible?
Oh no, it's totally possible. We've already done it in the United States. I think this is an opportunity to talk about two things. First off, you mentioned Germany. If you talk to Germans, they have similar insecurities about the fragility of their nationality, the fragility of their society. They are going through their own, extreme moment with the far right and far left gaining power. And they are subject to a lot of social instability, even if in many ways they look like a model of geopolitical stability right now. Countries always look far more stable than they actually are when you're looking at them from the outside. When you are so much more sensitive to our own issues and our own divisions, your own country always feels much more fragile.
My house is always struggling compared to the other house.
Yeah, you know too much.
Yeah.
You just know too much. So you have a much more complex understanding of your own country than you ever will of someone else's. And that's why the grass just looks greener over there. And that's why I kind of reacted when you mentioned Germany, because they're having this conversation too right now. Remember, they're the country that admitted over 1 million asylum seekers in 2015, 2016, and they continue to do so with Ukrainian refugees who are arriving. So they're having their own moment right now, even if they don't.
I know there's a second piece you want to get to, but I am curious about this, because you do bring up the notion of thin nationalism. Maybe I'm applying it wrong, but when you do say the word German, there are certain cultural attachments to that word, right? There's a culture, there's a society there, there's an identity. Whereas I think one of the arguments you made in the book was that America, when you think of American, is kind of open interpretation. And maybe it's that Germany slowly getting to that point. But do you think there's a difference in those identities, or is that something that—
The only difference is that there is a sense of rooted heritage in Germany and the continuity of that heritage that, a settler state like the United States or Australia or Canada does not boast. The continuity of heritage in our countries was disrupted because it was the heritage of Native Americans and indigenous peoples that, of course, were subject to genocide and mistreatment by colonists and settlers. Our history in many ways starts with the founding of sovereign modern nations in the 18th century. And so that is something that is fundamentally different from old European countries. But remember that even old European countries were subject to lots of construction and compilation. Germany itself was a federation of many smaller states, and it changed with the borders of Prussia and the Roman Empire, before that. So, these things are always, as I say, look more simple from the outside. The same is true for Italy. Britain, which is a very old nation, obviously, is a multi-ethnic nation with divisions between Wales and Scotland and the Northern Irish, of course. And they are also subject to enormous amounts of immigration today. So while I do think that continuity of heritage is there, I think it's overrated because it's all being questioned with the diversification of their countries, with greater secularism and greater globalization and cosmopolitanism.
Yeah, and again, thanks for sort of entertaining my random slip-in question there. It's just, you do such a great job of deconstructing this that I got to get all my questions out.
No worries.
Go ahead.
I thought this was a good opportunity to also just assert and problematize the idea of being a majority minority country in the United States here. We are subject to those same evolutions. So when the United States was founded, what it meant to be the majority, of course, was associated with whiteness. But whiteness itself in those days referred to a Northern European, mostly Anglo, Protestant whiteness. And over the course of the late 19th century, that changed. In 1845 until 1854, the Great Famine in Ireland pushed an influx of Irish into the United States at numbers that we were completely unseen in the history of our country. And then thereafter, they were followed by Germans, by Greeks, by Slavs, by Jews, by Italians. And, suddenly what it meant to be white was questioned, because if you think of whiteness from that old 18th century and 19th century lens, the United States, whiteness ended, in terms of its majority status, ended probably somewhere around the beginning of the 20th century. Those white ethnic groups that I mentioned earlier overtook white Anglo and white Northern European Protestants around that time. What ended up happening is we simply changed the way that we understood whiteness to eventually embrace those white ethnic groups, the Greeks and the Slavs and the Italians. Those all became what we now say are white people, but they never were back then, not in the sort of traditional definition of whiteness. And what that did was, not only did it postpone our ultimate majority minority milestone, which we now see it's revealed to be just something totally constructed, but it also allowed for the continued subjugation of people who were not white, who were not assimilable enough, who were not presentable enough as white, who didn't come close enough to qualifying. And that might have meant Middle Easterners initially, and South Asians. But it also, of course, it led to the continued subjugation of African Americans, and then thereafter Latinos. And so, our own country is more complicated than we look at from the outside. And this majority minority milestone is subject to precisely those same evolutions now. There's a white Hispanic group of Americans, people who are Hispanic and self-identify as white. That's 60% of all Latinos. That very well may just only self-identify as white in the future. We have a growing number of mixed race and biracial people in our country who very well may self-identify as white. That would also postpone our majority minority milestone that we expect to take place in 25 years. It might be a lot longer. It may not ever happen at all.
I promised you that I was going to get to the question of it being governable, but you did it again, and you said a bunch of smart things. And I got to ask one more question on sort of the history of this.
Okay.
You brought up the fact that the United States has actually gone through majority minority milestones, and your New York case study is a great example with Irish Americans, or at that time Irish folks, not Americans yet. Do you think it is harder to do you think this minority milestone that's coming up in 2044 is uniquely more difficult than the past milestones because the race, the aesthetic color of folks is different? And I know this is a tough question to answer because I know the book doesn't that too much, but does it make it uniquely more difficult to assimilate and to incorporate and to expand the definition of we when those that you're trying to assimilate have a fundamentally different color than yourself?
I don't know, because, I think it would be presentist to say that it's harder today. I wasn't there in the past, and my read of the history is that it was pretty hard back then. The Irish were so, and of course, the Irish were predominantly Catholic after 1845. The Irish were so discriminated against, so excluded, not to the same extent as African Americans, of course, who were denied voting rights, et cetera, after receiving citizenship. But they were so fundamentally excluded in New York society, for instance, that they were forced effectively to create their own institutions. It's why we see Irish and Catholic orphanages and hospitals and schools and universities today. Think about what the conditions had to have been in order to mobilize people to create these institutions so defensively, so protectively. If they were admitted into the mainstream and mainline institutions of the country, you wouldn't have had a need for, Fordham University or Catholic University, and these Catholic hospitals and orphanages and schools. They would have been admitted to them like anyone else. And so I've got to imagine that, through the eyes of Irishmen in America's past, that they had it pretty rough. It's a conversation without resolution. We'll never know.
Yeah.
But certainly race adds a different layer to all this. But in those days, religion was of paramount importance.
Yeah, and actually, if you sort of double clicked on that point, I think there's so much scholarship on how profound religious divisions were, how profound it was to be Protestant as opposed to being a Catholic. Again, the question becomes, and I think this is an argument that actually a lot of left-leaning folks would forward, is that race is an aesthetic trait that you can't get rid of. And does that make it slightly more difficult? But I think, to your point, we can't really compare. And I don't necessarily know if it's productive to. So let's get into the question of governability. You mentioned that the majority-minority milestone is governable. That gives me a lot of hope because it means that we have the ability to do something about it. What do you think leaders should do? And make the broader case of what do you think leaders should do when 2044 is approaching? What should they start talking about? What should they start implementing? How should they tackle this specific issue or opportunity?
Sure. So before we talk about what they should do, let's talk a little bit about what governments do. Sure. So in the face of great demographic change, the first thing that comes to many governments' minds are, how do we control this? In some cases, how do we stop it? But usually by the time you're worried about stopping it, it's probably too late because the cake is baked. Demography has a sort of inevitability to it because of fertility rates. It basically becomes an inevitability. But that aside, that hasn't stopped governments from trying. And there's three primary ways that governments try to address demographic change. And I refer to them as who comes, who counts, and who connects. And who comes is a matter of immigration. Who do you let in? Who do you admit into the country? And so governments have done a lot to try to restrict who comes into countries on the basis of racial or ethnic or religious, in some cases, selection. They also deport people sometimes according to the social boundaries that they constitute. So we see countries use immigration policy as a primary policy tool to affect who comes into the country. Who counts is about power. It's about the distribution of power. It's about who literally is counted as a citizen. And that gets down to census politics, gerrymandering of who is in districts and how you divide power and voting rights. And it comes down to the suppression of voting or the enablement of voting. It comes down to the way your institutions are formed. You think of like the United States Senate, which is giving outsized weight to sparsely populated rural states or small states who get the same amount of power as a state like Texas or Florida or California, New York. So all of these matter because it affects literally who counts and the power they're able to wield. And so you see countries often manipulate those institutions in order to preserve the power of the original racial or religious majority. And then who connects is really about intergroup engagement. It's about intergroup contact. And you do see countries engage in this with certain limited tools like segregation, like redlining, the segregation of schools and housing discrimination. All of that affects who is connecting and the extent to which people can actually relate to one another and build something together. Now that we understand kind of what countries do to control demographic change, the next question is, what do countries and what do governments do in order to include or exclude? And I refer to these as the 5 pivots of inclusion and exclusion. And so I'll go through each of the 5 now, and feel free to double click on any of the 5. The first is a national ideology, an idea of who we are, and the idea of sociologically and ideologically what makes the country what it is. And those ideologies can be very inclusive, and sometimes they're related to labor unions, or they could be related to socialism, or they can be related to some kind of nationalism. And those could be sometimes very inclusive ideologies. They can be very collectivist and multicultural. Others can be very exclusivist. They can only honor one side and not the other. And so that's a really key pivot. A second pivot relates to the socialization of youth. And so this refers to the politics of school curricula, the politics of textbooks, the politics of second languages, the politics of integration and segregation of schools. This may ring a bell, of course, here in the United States over the last few years when we've had debates over critical race theory, the Don't Say Gay Act in Florida, the book bannings that we've been seeing recently across the United States. These are very fraught politics because they can be inclusive, where you have desegregated schools, textbooks that acknowledge the contributions of all of a country's different minority groups and majority groups. Curricula that acknowledge those contributions more broadly, or they can be more narrow and restrictive. A third is commerce. Commerce, really is a way of bringing people together or separating them. You can bring people together by virtue of their interdependencies that the commercial system creates. We rely on each other for goods and services and expertise in many ways, and we often rely on people who are different from us to help us. But commerce can also be subject to the segmentation of labor markets, where certain people are not eligible for certain jobs. You can have broader markets where you have the racialization of poverty, and those are obviously toxic to any sense of inclusion. Then you have the politics of culture, inclusive and exclusive culture. And this is where you really get into the politics of the arts and sports, literature, cuisine, music, which are really subject to just remarkable fusion and hybridity. And it can really bring a country together and be very integrative and inclusive in nature. But we've also seen a lot of debates in those spaces, where you have debates over the presence of Confederate memorials and monuments across the American South, where you have debates over speech and protected speech when a football player takes a knee during the national anthem. And so we've seen precisely these cultural areas being subject to divisive politics as well as inclusive politics. And then finally, it's the politics of threat. Whether we identify our threats to be external, like another country, like a virus, Martians, or whether they're internal threats, which is very divisive when we believe that the greatest threat to our country comes from fellow countrymen, that the greatest threat is actually inside our gates, which of course is obviously going to be very exclusive in nature. And so those 5 pivots, ideology, socialization of youth, commerce, culture, and threat, are really the pivots on which society makes a decision about how they collectively move towards inclusion and exclusion. And, I think in the modern United States today, we see evidence of all different 5 pivots going in both directions. We are very much at a crossroads.
You don't say. I think let me actually repeat the sort of 5 pivots, because I think that they, and based on sort of how you've described it, provides a good framework for how to think about it. National ideology, socialization of youth, commerce, culture, politics of threat. I want to take a quick step back, and I'm not going to double click on any of those because I want to make sure we get to audience questions. And those of you that are listening right now, the next 20 minutes are your 20 minutes. So please, if you've got any questions, anything you want to ask Justin, this is your moment, and we will ask those questions. You said who counts, who comes, who connects. Let's apply this. And I know this is putting you on the spot, and this is probably an unfair question, but let's apply this to the Buffalo shooting. You know, how would you ideally want our leaders to react to that shooting? What would it entail if you had your magic wand and you said, this is how we navigate this specific, because these instances are going to happen more and more, right? And we're going to see more instances of violence based specifically on racial lines. How should we approach something like that? What should leaders do about that shooting?
Our leaders need to model the connection that we are advocating that we must build. We need to see our leaders defeat polarization on an individual basis to be the change that they want to see in the world. We need to see political leaders breaking bread with one another across the aisle. So we need to see enemies sitting down at the same table, sharing a burger or a cup of coffee or a beer. You know, we need to see, people of different races and different backgrounds coming together in ways that are trying to facilitate mutual understanding, where we are actually airing our senses of grievance, our senses of vulnerability in a place that makes people feel safe to do so. Earlier you asked what makes this conversation so difficult. And what I failed to mention as well is controversy, is discomfort. These are challenging conversations to have, and they're tended to be held privately in the United States and not publicly because of fears of retaliation or cancellation. And I think we actually need to have it out. Ultimately, these conversations aren't being had, but they're siloed. And they're not actually a secret because most of them are on the internet. You can see them anytime you want to, but they're not actually crossing anywhere. And so our leaders, I think, in the most public way possible, have to encourage these conversations and have them together. But they need to model the change that they want to actually see. And the problem is, I think that politically, our leaders are very concerned about leveraging our polarization into votes, and both parties are guilty of this to some degree. There's a sense that no rewards will come from that kind of outreach. But I really disagree. I think our country is exhausted by polarization. Even if we are complicit in it, I think we're exhausted by it. And so I think that a leader who has the courage, but also the skill to transcend these boundaries would do a lot of good for both themselves and also the country.
I don't want to ask any more questions. I want to leave it there because I think if we were in person, that would have been a mic drop moment. I just want to emphasize the notion that leaders have to model. And we've seen this time and time again, Justin, on all the different campuses and all of the conversations we have. And now I'm going to transition into audience questions because there's people far more intelligent than me wanting to ask questions. So let's get into it. And let's try to keep our answers short because we've got a lot of questions and I want to make sure we try to get to as many as possible. The first question is that has there been a culture, and you did talk about this a little bit, but has there been a culture that has transitioned from one majority race to a majority minority without conflict?
Yeah, the closest case is Hawaii. Okay. So when Hawaii, the short story of Hawaii is that the native population was decimated by disease that was brought by Western explorers and settlers. But that's actually not why the majority minority shift happened. It was because of the importation of labor. When Westerners settled in Hawaii, they created plantations that had a voracious appetite for labor, and native Hawaiians did not want to work there. And there weren't enough of them to work there anyway, even if they wanted to. And so they imported labor from Japan, from China, from the Philippines, eventually from places like Puerto Rico and also Portugal. So they came from everywhere. And that's why if you go to Hawaii, you'll see last names from everywhere around the earth. The reception to these foreigners was not great initially. There was a lot of nativism, a desire to sort of maintain the status of Kanaka, of people who are of indigenous Hawaiian heritage. And the monarchy actually did quite a bit to try to sort of reinforce that status. But that changed. And it changed because Hawaiians leveraged their rich cultural traditions to recognize the virtues of foreigners and their humanity, but also their role in being guardians of Hawaii and being guardians of the land, the Aina. And I think that is something that is incredibly didactic, is that, you know, independent of how you feel about foreigners coming to your country, they are guardians of it. They become part of it and they are part of your team, much in the way, you know, you may not be happy about, you know, your favorite football team or basketball team making a trade, but you certainly hope for the very best, that the players play the best when they get there, for the sake of that team. And Hawaiians kind of had that enlightened view. It also led to a lot of intermarriage. So Native Hawaiians were actually financially incentivized. I should say that immigrants were financially incentivized to marry indigenous families for land access. And so many, particularly Chinese families, intermarried with Kanaka, with indigenous Native Hawaiian families as well. And that broke down boundaries remarkably well. And so, you know, when the assimilationist politics of the United States came around in the early 20th century, the non-white population, almost as an act of resistance against American assimilationism, bonded together with Native Hawaiians in a sort of Native Hawaiian / immigrant movement. And it changed the way the Hawaiians saw themselves and saw their country.
This isn't an audience question, but I'm curious. Do you think that it's easier to govern this majority-minority milestone with a non-white person as president?
No, actually. Ironically, what psychological research suggests is that it would be easier if you had a member of the ethnic or racial or religious majority as your leader, easing a country into its diversification. A sort of trusted in-group person is more likely to persuade any kind of fears or uncertainties among the majority group. In fact, I think a lot of the sort of reactions to the majority-minority milestone, it took place underneath the Obama administration, which itself heralded the demographic change that was descending upon the United States. That's not to say that, you know, you shouldn't be electing people of color, of course. That would be preposterous. But psychologically, if you want to know what people's propensities are, hearing from an in-group, hearing from someone who self-identifies as one of you, as one of the majority group, is more likely to persuade members of that majority who may otherwise be skeptical. And that's actually not only from my research, but from a number of other political psychologists.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I just know that I want to ask some questions that I know are in people's minds, but are tough to ask. And I'll take the heat for it. The next audience question is, you said the backlash to immigration was a motivation for the book. Do you think that the backlash is against all immigration or just illegal immigration?
No, I think we've reached the point in the United States politics now where those who are anti-immigration are generally against almost any immigration. You know, and I know this just because we can use the attempt to pass some kind of immigration reform under the Trump administration as our guide. So around 2019, the Trump administration hatched a plan to shift to what they called a merit-based system of points where immigrants would receive extra credits to be admitted by virtue of the credentials or qualifications that they bring to the table. And that bill was dead on arrival in Capitol Hill because the Republican caucus was against anything, any kind of reforms to the system that did not lead to the reduction of annual flows of people into the country. And so I think anti-immigration at this point, at least on the right of the country, is just generally against any kind of immigration that would increase or keep immigration stable, even. And to me, that's distressing, actually, because I think that immigration is so important to this country's future, nationalistically even. I think that when people decree illegal and undocumented immigration, in many ways, it's a justification for a broader anti-immigrant sentiment, because that's just what we see in terms of voting habits and rhetoric. So many immigrants, the vast majority of immigrants, are entering the country completely legally with documentation. I don't think that it's just about the illegality of people who enter without authorization or overstay their visas.
Understood. So this question, Justin, we got twice, once before the program, once during the program. And so we're going to ask it. Is it time to end affirmative action? When I apply for jobs, they ask my race and sex and say it won't affect my selection. Then why do they ask?
So I don't think I'm really qualified to opine.
And that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I think this is a little outside of my own range. What I can tell you is that the politics of affirmative action ends up being divisive. We are, and I think it's one of these kind of irresolvable matters in American politics, and it's leveraged by both sides in order to politicize. But it's not something that I study closely enough to really have strong opinions.
By the way, I just want to highlight that answer and say that it's okay to say, I'm not sure.
That's why you should trust me.
I hope people are taking notes. It's all right if we don't know the answer. It's much better.
Don't trust any expert who knows the answer to everything.
I know, and everyone's trying to be an expert these days in everything. I was not an expert in Ukraine until 3 months ago. So the next question I've got is from an audience member named Liz Joyner. But I want to make sure I ask it because I think it fits well into this piece of the conversation, which is that a powerful and potentially frame-shifting part of the argument that you make is that nationalism is the turf on which progress must be made. And you compare it to a bamboo finger trap, that it tightens as you pull harder on it. Can you explain that phenomenon?
Sure. So, I think most of our, listeners and viewers are familiar with the bamboo finger trap. It's one of these kind of woven bamboo tubes that you put your fingers in. And what you find is that the harder you resist it by pulling your fingers back out of it, the tighter it actually gets on your fingers, making it more challenging to release yourself. Because the human inclination when placed into the tube is to remove our fingers. But actually, the way to actually beat the trap is to actually go with the tension of the bamboo finger trap by going inwards in order to loosen it. Only then will it loosen enough around your fingers to let you escape. And I think that nationalism is that way. Nationalism is such a powerful political force, such a mobilizer in our country right now. And I think it's being monopolized by only those who are on the right, for the sake of nostalgia and for the sake of their politics right now, much of which is anti-immigration, as we've discussed already. But the left has largely abandoned that space. They see nationalism as vile, as foul, as exclusive and restrictivist. And in many cases, it is. Nationalism can be that way. But nationalism is also, at its core, not about those things at all. It's really just about the connection of a nation of people to their land, and the survival of that nation, the survival of the we, of who we are. And I think that the left would do very well for itself is to not treat it as a bamboo finger trap, because the more they resist it, the more they're getting defeated by it. What they really need to do is lean into nationalism and reorient it into something that can actually be a powerful justification for leftist goals. For instance, I think that there's a strong nationalist case for immigration that we've talked about, because the survival of the nation depends on the sustainability of its population. And the only way we are going to be sustainable as a population is by either producing more children or letting people more into the country. And so immigration is a really powerful basis for national survival. When it comes to healthcare, there's a lot of resistance to redistribution and to the provision of healthcare to everyone. But actually, healthcare is the most nationalist thing you can provide because it lifts all boats. It strengthens the country's health. It leads to longer life expectancy so that you don't need as much immigration. It also promotes a more healthy workforce and strengthens the economy. And many people who are, there are a lot of anxiety, I think, from a racial perspective, because there's this sense that, Obamacare, for instance, which is the most significant health bill in a generation, was only benefiting minorities. But in fact, actually, the God's honest truth is that it was actually being taken up by more white Americans than people of color. And so it really is the kind of issue that is both in the national interest to have and one that actually helps everyone equally. And so we shouldn't be so fussed about who particular it's helping the whole country. So anyway, there's lots of examples. Climate change is another good example. And this all comes from an article I wrote in the Washington Post about a month or so ago that people can reference. But it's also in the book as well.
I think I have the idea and title for your next book, which is The Liberal Case for Nationalism. So trademarked. The next question I've got, and actually builds on this a little bit, is it seems the USA has always been searching for a universal cultural heritage, a meta-narrative. Is that even possible? How can we accept the cultural heritage of various groups? And I would ask, and should we?
We must. We have to try. We absolutely have to try. So it's going to be hard. And up until now, the sort of attempts to create some kind of universal heritage, something unifying, has been subject to what I call thin nationalisms, as opposed to like thick. Thick nationalism usually is connected to ethnicity and religion and race, which, as we know, are really divisive and not suitable for a country as diverse and diversifying as our own. Thin nationalisms, unfortunately, are too thin. It's a Goldilocks problem. You have something that's too thin or too thick. The thin nationalisms do not have enough of a sense of distinction. They use kind of liberal values, universal values to connect people, but that are not uniquely American. We have to think hard about what it is that actually holds this country together. Yes, it's challenging to do that. Maybe it's an impossible goal, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue it. I think we have to think really hard. And I think that we have incredible material to work with. This country ultimately is a country that swoons over dreams. We love comeback kids. We love underdogs, and we're all about dreams, but we're also all about struggle. And that common sense of struggle, that mutual understanding of dreams, is something that unites all Americans, because at our core, this country is really about a land of opportunity, a land of possibility, and in a way that no other country in the world can possibly relate to. And that is some really strong fundamentals to build off of. The other thing that we can build off, I think, is our shared heritage as immigrants. And certainly there is still a small minority of people of indigenous background in the United States, but even Native Americans in this country now are mixed in with people of immigrant heritage. Everyone is touched by some kind of journey to this country, which is a really big benefit when you compare to a country like Germany, for instance, where the majority can actually, relate to some kind of heritage in the soil, in the dirt. Very few Americans can. And that's actually a way to bring us together so that we can all recognize the journey that all of us are in. And so I think we have a lot of strong material to work from. And it's a matter of building leadership and courageous people, millions of them, who can leverage that into a common understanding of who we are.
I mean, I think that is not only spot on, but it's going on the offense. Stop succumbing to the problem, use it as an opportunity, and then hold people's anxiety. What is your advice, Justin, to organizations that are currently bridging and focused on bringing folks together and hosting those dialogues for how they can be optimally effective for affecting positive change in the politics of identity? And I think part of your answer, actually, that last answer answered a lot of that, but I'm curious, what do you think bridging organizations should do on this question?
Sure. So they can definitely, point by point, think about those different pivots that we talked about already. They should definitely be in the conversation about who we are and go into it open-mindedly. They should create safe spaces for people to say uncomfortable truths, to reveal what's sacred to them, even at the risk of offending some people. I think a lot of organizations are already doing those things. The other things that I would add, though, is think about scale. We really need to go big. A local community dinner, wonderful. It has a wonderful effect. But for organizations that are more ambitious, think about how we actually broaden this. Is there a social media strategy that you can pursue? Is there a way of actually reaching more people with megaphones out there that you can pursue? It really matters. Now, that's not to discount small ways that each of us can play a role. I mentioned earlier that we need millions of leaders. Try to affect your own family, your own organization, your own business. Be your own governor, and I think that really matters. But we also have to think about scale too. And then finally, for those of you who do pursue scale, measure, see what effect you're having. It can't, good feeling is not enough. We need evidence. And so work with researchers and consider how you can actually gather evidence to recognize the change that you're building and how you can actually help others do the same.
How do you think we should talk about this in the language of not the left, but the center?
What do you mean, Manu?
So I think that there's a lot of questions about, how do we have conversations among one another to increase inclusivity? Or how do you speak to and persuade our fellow citizens who hold Native, anti-immigrant, anti-minority views? And the problem I have with all those questions is that if you immediately start off with, let's have a conversation about inclusivity, you're already turning off so many folks because those words have been politicized.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do we talk about this problem without politicizing the conversation?
Sure. So there's two factors here. First off, the idea of diversity and inclusion has become, has connotations to it at this juncture. And I'm sorry to say this, it's not something I'm happy to report, but it has connotations among white Americans that this is not a space for me. And that is absolutely terrible for progress. We need white Americans, especially white men, in the room when we are talking about diversity and inclusion. They need to feel that they are a part of these conversations, that this is a space for them to share their vulnerability, for them to listen, but also to talk, and that place that they're welcome. And so, I think that's a really important trend. And so those of you who are in the diversity and inclusion space have to ask yourselves, who's not here right now? Who's missing? Because those are folks who may be the people who need to actually be there the most, not to be educated, but to be included. The second thing is that unfortunately, one of the risks of having only Joe Biden right now speaking about national unity as a priority is that we risk that it becomes a Democratic prerogative, a Democratic agenda, when in fact it actually must be an American agenda, an American priority. And so it's very important that those on the left who care about this are cultivating partners on the right. You cannot do this on your own. And it's the kind of thing where you do not win if you are the one who gets credit for any progress that you make. You only win if you and someone from the other side of the aisle are also doing it together. It must be something that is done in conjoint, in coherence with the other side. And that's part of modeling the change that you want to see. So I think that those are really big risks right now. And I see what you mean by that question now, Manu. They're very important. National unity cannot be just a Democratic talking point. It must be an American talking point. It must be something that transcends partisan boundaries.
Yeah, and while we have people's attention, because I think that is a fascinating thing to unpack, and I wish we had another hour, but while we have people's attention, I want to make sure that folks know that Eliza, and Eliza, if you could drop a link in the chat to the post survey. Please note that myself, BridgeUSA, and Village Square Liz Joyner's group are participating in a national pilot program to figure out whether or not these conversations actually have an impact on our attitudes towards pluralism, dialogue, empathy. So please, please, please click on that link. We need that pre and post survey results. You're probably asking yourself, this is such an annoying request. And I want you to know that Justin's entire conversation is about us taking action.
We just talked about measurement.
Take action, measure, measure, measure. Please let us know whether or not this conversation is useful. I've got one last question for you. And this isn't an audience question. This is another question that I think is highly relevant to this conversation. It's a personal one. And I think this will actually be a great way for us to wrap up how people should be thinking about this. You recently wrote in USA Today about your father's immigrant story. As we close tonight's conversation, could you say a word about your dad and the power of family stories and the power of our experiential stories and how they play a role in stitching this union together?
Of course, thanks, Manu, for asking about that. My father recently passed away from cancer, and it was a tragic event in my family for sure. But it also, in many ways, was really powerful in the way that it kind of connected to my own work, to my scholarship, to my profession. My father, as I mentioned at the start, was a refugee. He came to this country with pretty much nothing. He was in a New York tenement, a chicken farm in New Jersey, worked his way up to become a middle class professional. And when he died, my family and we found a stash of gold coins in a safe that I didn't even know about, next to a hunting knife and some government documents. It was the kind of thing that you would expect from like someone who was a fugitive or someone who was, fearing the apocalypse was about to happen. And my father, of course, was not a fugitive, and he wasn't a survivalist, in that kind of way. I joke that my father didn't even like beef jerky. He was a refugee, and ultimately what he was consumed by, and it revealed just the extent to which he was consumed, was by this sense that it could all be taken away. At any given moment, everything he had could be taken away. And I think that that's somehow part of who we are as Americans. I think that's part of the American condition. So many of our families came here without nothing. And in a country this diverse, ethnically, racially, sexually, religiously, geographically, culturally, I think that there's always going to be this consumption with status. We are consumed with status. I think it's what leads us to fight over redistribution, to fight over identity politics. It's ultimately the sense of insecurity that everything you have could be taken away or negated. And it's because of the instability that was the sort of baptism of our arrival in this country. And, the piece that you mentioned was a reflection on that. And maybe that is what holds us together. Maybe that is one of those things that transcends us as Americans that no other country can claim. And it's not necessarily the most exciting part of who we are as Americans, but maybe it's the most poignant. So I'm happy to leave everyone with the story of my father, and I'm hoping I'm happy that to the extent that he can inspire any of us to think more broadly about who we are. And if anyone's interested in more of these kinds of articles, they're welcome to check out my website, justingest.com, which maybe we can put into the chat, or follow me on Twitter at __ Justin Gest for more of this kind of content. But yeah, I think in anything that we do, our family becomes a piece of us, and we're expressions of them.
Justin, thank you so much for your research, your hard work. JustinGest.com. For anyone that's listening, please check it out. JustinGest.com, and it's guest without a U, so G-E-S-T. His book is Majority Minority. It is a fascinating read, and importantly, I learned so much just from that conversation. Thank you, sir, for sharing about your father. I'm going to take a quick minute to close here. Are there any last words that you've got? Anything else that you want the audience to leave with? Somehow we've managed to keep so many people's attention for an hour and 30 minutes, and there's hundreds of people watching across stream. So really quickly, I want to create space. Is there anything else that you want to touch on or cover?
People ask me, why are you so optimistic about the future of this country, despite all the evidence to the contrary right now? And my optimism comes from the fact that I don't actually even think we've tried to tackle the politics of demographic change this far. We've been going by the seat of our pants. So I think that all of us can be partners in addressing demographic change and thinking about how we pivot towards inclusion and how we include each other in our daily lives. And so that's the source of my optimism, is that we haven't even tried. And if there's one thing that unites Americans, is that when we put our minds to something, we have a pretty good chance of succeeding.
We haven't even tried. And for all those that are currently listening that are not on the Zoom chat, Justin's Twitter, Justin Gest, it's a handle with a beautiful butterfly. Please check that out as well. I just want everyone to know that the work that you're doing here is not only important, but as a 23-year-old who's got to live with this in a generation that's not only mired in conflict and division, but a generation that has so much to live up to, it means a lot to have your book as a North Star in that conversation. I want to thank the Village Square. I want to thank the Florida Humanities program. I want to thank again Justin for his work. The note of optimism is so important. And lastly, I just want to say that there is a movement of people that are working on this problem, not specifically just the problem majority minority, but stitching our union together. Justin talked about polarization. I work with an organization called BridgeUSA. We work with young people across the country. We have organizations like Braver Angels, the Village Square, Listen First Project. There's so many folks that are doing this amazing work. And so if you felt compelled to act, I think that was the message that Justin wanted us to leave with, is act with optimism, approach the problem with urgency, and think about these solutions in a productive and constructive way. And we've got lots of opportunity to reap. Justin, any last closing words?
No, just thank you to each of you guys and the various organizations for putting this together and for inviting me.
Thank you, everybody. And again, majority minority, Justin Gest, justingest.com. Thank you all so much. And thank you to the Village Square. Bye, everyone.
Nice.